a lighthouse Cape Ashford tried to forget, a locked door beneath the stairs, and a Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole who came only for an inheritance. But his loyal K-9 Ranger heard what no one else could hear and found the secret hidden beneath the light. What they uncovered was not a ghost, but proof that two fathers died trying to reveal the truth.
Easy.
If you believe God can use even a wounded dog to guide a broken man through darkness, stay with this story. Comment Amen and follow for more stories of faith, loyalty, justice, healing, and redemption. Cape Ashford, Maine, sat at the far edge of the Atlantic, like a town built for people who had learned to survive bad weather without complaining. A place of black pine ridges, salt-stained roofs, narrow roads glazed with ice, and fishing boats tied down so tightly at the harbor that they looked less like vessels than animals bracing for punishment. And on the night Ethan Cole drove north through the storm, the whole coastline seemed to vanish and reappear in broken flashes of snow, headlight glare, and sea fog rolling inland like smoke from a battlefield. The first real blizzard of December had come hard before sunset, closing the county roads, swallowing the old lobster shacks beyond the harbor, and turning the cliff road toward Whitaker Point into a white tunnel where the Atlantic thundered somewhere below the rocks, unseen but always present, a deep animal sound beneath the wind. Ethan Cole kept both hands on the wheel of his dark government-issue Chevy Tahoe, not because the road frightened him, but because old training had taught him that the worst mistakes happened when a man believed he was too experienced to be surprised, and Ethan had survived too many places built to surprise men. He was 39 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a compact, disciplined build that still carried the shape of years inside naval special warfare. His face cut sharp by exhaustion, his steel blue eyes quiet and watchful beneath short ash-brown hair, his beard trimmed close with a few gray strands already gathering at the jaw. And even out here in civilian weather, he wore the same practical seriousness that made strangers lower their voices around him. Tonight, under his heavy winter jacket, he still wore his full U.S. Navy working uniform. Type 3, long-sleeve blouse and trousers in AOR2, digital woodland. The green pattern half hidden by snowmelt and darkness, with brown combat boots planted steady on the pedals, like the storm was only another hostile environment to be read, measured, and crossed. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head from the passenger seat, an 8-year-old German Shepherd K-9 with black and tan working line markings, a thick winter coat, intelligent amber-brown eyes, and the calm, dangerous stillness of a dog that had spent years finding explosives before men stepped on them. Ranger was not young anymore, his muzzle dusted with gray, and one ear notching slightly at the tip from an old deployment injury. But there was nothing soft in the way he studied the road ahead, only loyalty sharpened by habit and a kind of silent judgment Ethan trusted more than most human opinions. 3 days earlier, Ethan had been in Norfolk reviewing cold case maritime intelligence when the call came from a law office in Portland. And at first he had nearly ignored it because family news rarely came to him unless somebody wanted a signature, a denial, or a piece of a history. No one had bothered explaining while the people involved were still alive. The attorney, Margaret Harlan, had introduced herself in a voice careful enough to sound rehearsed, and Ethan had pictured her exactly as she later appeared on the video call. A woman in her late 50s with silver blonde hair pinned tightly behind her head, narrow reading glasses hanging from a chain, and a composed, coastal New England face that had probably informed hundreds of grieving families about wills, liens, unpaid taxes, and unpleasant surprises without once raising her tone. She was not unkind, but she had the guarded manner of someone who knew the document in front of her contained a problem. Thomas Whitaker, she told him, had died quietly in his sleep at 74, leaving Ethan the Whitaker Point Lighthouse and the keeper's cottage attached to it, a property abandoned, sealed, and legally disputed for nearly 18 years after the wreck of the rescue vessel St. Elian, when 3 men died in a storm off Cape Ashford, including Captain Daniel Turner, a respected local mariner whose name Ethan knew only because Harlan said the town still carved flowers into the memorial each October. Ethan's first response had been simple: sell it, donate it, burn it down if the county allowed it. Because Thomas Whitaker had been his mother's brother by blood and a stranger by every other measure, a hard, private man, Ethan remembered only in fragments from childhood, tall and raw-boned, with tobacco-colored fingers, pale eyes, and a voice that seemed to come from behind a locked door even when he was standing in the same room. Thomas had worked lighthouse maintenance before the Coast Guard automated most of the stations, then retreated into lawsuits, rumors, and isolation after the St. Elian disaster. And the family had spoken about him the way people spoke about storms that had moved offshore but might still turn back. Margaret Harlan had waited through Ethan's silence before adding the part that changed everything. Thomas had left one condition written in his own hand, and Ethan was not to sign, sell, transfer, or refuse the property until he personally entered the lighthouse with Ranger beside him. Not with a dog, not with his animal, not even with the K9, but with Ranger named clearly in black ink. Though Thomas Whitaker had never met Ranger, had never seen Ethan work with him, and should not have known the dog existed at all. That detail stayed in Ethan's mind as the Tahoe crawled through the storm outside Cape Ashford. And the farther he drove from the last gas station and the last weak cell signal, the more the condition felt less like inheritance and more like a message left by a man who expected to die before he could explain himself. Ranger seemed to feel it too, because the dog had been quiet for most of the drive until the road bent toward Whitaker Point, and then his posture changed all at once. Head lifted higher, ears forward, nose testing the air through the faint draft along the windowsill, body no longer resting, but braced. Ethan glanced at him without turning his head fully, the way he used to check a teammate's movement in the corner of his eye. "You smell the ocean, or something I need to care about?" he murmured. But Ranger did not flick an ear at the joke. He stared through the snow at the darkness ahead, and a low sound rolled once in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but something closer to recognition. The lighthouse appeared suddenly through the blowing white, first as a pale vertical shape on the cliff line, and then as a full tower rising out of the storm, its old brick sides darkened by salt and age, its lantern room black against the gray sky, its attached keeper's cottage sagging beneath a roof loaded with snow. And for a moment Ethan understood why old sailors had built superstitions around places like this, because the structure did not look abandoned so much as it looked like it had been waiting with its breath held. The chain across the access road hung broken between 2 iron posts, half buried in snow, and the county seal nailed to the gate had been peeled back by wind or by hands. Beyond it, the driveway curved toward a small gravel lot where no fresh tire tracks showed beneath the falling storm. Only smooth white accumulation untouched except where the Tahoe's headlights cut across it. Ethan killed the engine near the keeper's cottage, and silence fell so completely that the surf below the cliff seemed louder, booming under the wind, while snow ticked against the windshield like fingernails. Ranger moved before Ethan opened his door, stepping across the console with controlled urgency, then dropping into the snow as soon as Ethan let him out, his paws sinking deep, his nose lowered, his body angled not toward the cottage, but toward the lighthouse door at the base of the tower. Ethan followed with his duffel over one shoulder and his flashlight in hand, feeling the weather hit his face with a cold so sharp it seemed to cut through skin and memory alike. The front entrance stood beneath a shallow stone arch blackened by years of salt spray, and there, exactly where Margaret Harlan had sworn the property had been locked, sealed, and untouched since the investigation ended, the heavy wooden door stood open 3 inches. Not blown wide, not torn loose, not hanging broken from its hinges, but carefully open, as if someone had stepped inside and left it that way for him. Ethan stopped 10 feet from the threshold, and Ranger stopped with him, the dog's tail rigid, his eyes fixed on the crack of darkness between door and frame. Ethan's expression did not change, but inside him the old combat rhythm woke with a clean, cold precision. Windows, corners, high ground, blind spots, secondary entry points, possible movement above, possible movement below. And his gloved hand moved to the knife clipped inside his jacket before he even thought about it. The storm pushed at his back, lifting snow across the stone steps, and the door creaked inward by a fraction, exposing a smell that did not belong to empty property. Old dust, salt-rotted wood, dead ash from a fireplace long cold, and beneath it all, a faint metallic bitterness that touched something in Ethan's memory before he could name it. Gun oil. Not fresh, not heavy, but there, threaded into the air like a warning written too softly. Inside, the lighthouse entry chamber was round and narrow, its brick walls sweating with cold, its spiral stairs rising along the curve into darkness, its floor scattered with plaster flakes, gull feathers, and old dust thick enough to preserve every disturbance. Ethan swept his flashlight low first, then up, then low again, and that was when he saw the footprints crossing the floor from the open door toward the stairwell. Wet boot prints, large, deliberate, recent enough that the edges still glistened where snowmelt had not fully soaked into the dust. Ranger did not bark. That bothered Ethan more than barking would have. The dog stood just past the threshold with his nose lifted toward the stairs, every muscle tight beneath his black and tan coat, his breathing shallow and controlled, his eyes following something Ethan could not see. And for one strange second, Ethan had the feeling that Ranger was not discovering this place, but remembering it from a story his body knew and his mind could not explain. He moved deeper, each step slow enough to keep the floorboards from announcing him too loudly, though the tower answered anyway with old groans and distant metal ticks from somewhere above or below. Near the stairwell, a dark stain marked the edge of the floor where the dust had been rubbed thin. Not a puddle, not fresh, but unmistakably blood dried into the wood long ago and recently scraped across by someone's boot. Ethan crouched without touching it, the flashlight beam steady in his hand, his face unreadable as he studied the stain, the footprints, the angle of movement, and the narrow cellar door half hidden beneath the curve of the stairs. He thought of Thomas Whitaker dying with Ranger's name in his will, of the St. Elian sinking in Blackwater 18 years earlier, of 3 men dead and a lighthouse locked so tightly that even the town preferred not to speak about it. And the pattern forming in his mind felt less like inheritance now than an ambush built out of time. Then, from beneath the floor near the base of the stairwell, came a soft metallic tap, one small sound under the wind and the surf, but precise enough to freeze both man and dog in place. Ranger lowered his head immediately and moved toward the wall, not growling now, not afraid in the ordinary way, but focused with the old certainty he used when scent led to something buried and dangerous. He pressed his nose to the baseboard beside the cellar steps, inhaled once, and began to scratch with his front paw. Slow at first, then harder, claws dragging through dust and old paint, until a strip of warped paneling shifted inward with a hollow knock. Ethan stepped closer, heart slowing into that dangerous calm he knew too well. And when he pulled the loosened board away, darkness opened behind the wall where solid wood should have been. Cold air breathed out from the hidden space, carrying the same metallic scent. Stronger now, and Ethan understood that the Whitaker Point Lighthouse was not simply abandoned, not simply inherited, and not simply haunted by an old maritime tragedy. Something had been sealed inside it, something someone had returned for. And as Ranger stood rigid beside the opening, staring into the blackness as if the blackness had a pulse, Ethan realized the lighthouse was hiding something still alive, in the dark. Morning came to Cape Ashford without warmth, only a thin gray light pressing through the storm clouds and spreading over the harbor like cold ash, revealing lobster boats crusted with ice, shuttered bait shops along the waterfront, and narrow streets where plows had pushed snow into dirty banks beside houses that looked as if they had been holding their breath all night. Ethan Cole drove down from Whitaker Point with Ranger stretched across the back seat of the Tahoe, the old German shepherd's head resting low between his paws, his amber-brown eyes still open, still tracking every sound beyond the windows, though a thin line of blood had dried along his front pad where a shard of broken glass from the Lighthouse entry chamber had cut him some time before dawn. Ethan had cleaned it once with bottled water and wrapped it with gauze from his field kit. But Ranger had limped when they left the tower, and Ethan knew enough about working dogs to understand that a K9 would hide pain until the body had no choice but to show it. So he followed the faded blue sign near the harbor that read Turner Animal Clinic, tucked behind a salt-worn pharmacy and a closed diner whose windows glowed faintly through the snow. The clinic smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, old wood, and coffee that had been left too long on a warmer. And behind the counter stood Abby Turner, a 34-year-old veterinarian with dark auburn hair tied carelessly at the nape of her neck. A lean, practical build shaped more by long hours and emergency calls than by any attempt at elegance, and clear hazel eyes that could soften instantly for an injured animal while staying guarded with the people who brought them in. Abby was not tall, but she carried herself with the direct steadiness of someone who had spent years forcing fear into usefulness, and there was a faint tiredness at the corners of her mouth that did not come from one bad night. It came from growing up in a town where everyone knew how her father died. Everyone had an opinion about it, and almost no one wanted the official story disturbed. When Ethan stepped inside in his full NWU Type 3 uniform under the open winter jacket, brown combat boots leaving slush on the mat, Abby first looked at the dog, not the man, and that small choice told Ethan more about her than any introduction would have. "Bring him back," she said, already moving toward the exam room, her voice calm, clipped and professional, the kind used by people who knew panic made wounds worse. Ranger allowed Abby to lift his paw, though he watched her hands with the careful patience of a veteran who had learned the difference between help and threat. And Abby noticed that too, because her expression shifted slightly when she saw the old deployment scars beneath the thick black and tan coat, the notch in one ear, the gray along his muzzle, and the way he kept his body angled toward Ethan even while submitting to treatment. "He's not a pet," she said, not accusing, only reading what was in front of her. Ethan answered that Ranger was a retired K9 from Naval Special Warfare Support Operations, trained for explosives, tracking, and search. And Abby's hands paused only long enough to show respect before she went back to work, flushing the shallow cut, removing a glass sliver so small it flashed like ice in the tray, and wrapping the pad with practiced efficiency. She asked where it happened, and Ethan said Whitaker Point Lighthouse, because there was no useful lie that would not become more complicated later. And the moment the name left his mouth, Abby's face changed so sharply that Ranger lifted his head from the table, and Ethan saw the wound behind her eyes before she covered it. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the heater and the faint clicking of sleet against the window, and then Abby said, "That place should still be sealed," in a voice lower than before. Ethan watched her without interrupting. Abby pulled the tape around Ranger's bandage a little tighter than necessary, caught herself, loosened it, and finally told him that her father, Captain Daniel Turner, had commanded the St. Elian, a volunteer rescue vessel that went out during a storm 18 years earlier after a distress call came from somewhere beyond Whitaker Point. Officially, the engine failed, the sea took the boat, and 3 men died before dawn. But Abby had never believed the report because her father had known storms, engines, reefs, and that coastline better than any investigator who arrived after the bodies were gone. She had been 16 then, still all elbows and anger, a girl with her father's old Coast Guard jacket hanging too large from her shoulders, and the last thing Daniel Turner left behind was not a goodbye, but a voicemail that broke through static just before midnight. The lighthouse didn't go out. Someone turned it off. Abby had heard that sentence so many times that it no longer sounded like memory. It sounded like a door in her life that had never closed. Ethan did not tell her about the hidden hollow behind the stairwell wall, not yet, but he did ask whether the lighthouse had been searched after the wreck, and Abby gave him a look that suggested the question had kept her awake for half her life. The investigation had lasted 9 days, she said, long enough for officials to photograph the tower, remove old logs, issue a report, and tell Cape Ashford to mourn properly, but not long enough to answer why the beacon record showed a power interruption during the exact window when the St. Elian vanished. Thomas Whitaker had been the last civilian keeper assigned to maintain the backup system before automation, and after the disaster he stopped attending town meetings, stopped answering questions, and let the lighthouse rot behind county seals until people decided guilt and grief looked enough alike to leave him alone. Ethan listened with the same stillness he used in briefings before dangerous work, but Ranger shifted on the exam table and looked toward the back room of the clinic, where an old framed photograph hung crooked beside a shelf of medical supplies. A younger Abby standing on a dock beside a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, a thick brown mustache, and the open, steady smile of someone who trusted the sea, even when he respected it. Captain Daniel Turner, Ethan understood, had not become a mystery to his daughter because he died. He became one because the town asked her to stop asking how. By noon, Abby had closed the clinic for lunch but did not eat, and while Ethan took Ranger outside to let the dog test his bandaged foot in the alley behind the building, she unlocked a metal file box from beneath her office desk and pulled out the kind of records grief teaches a person to preserve: folded marine charts, weather reports printed from obsolete websites, photocopied Coast Guard statements, a cassette copy of the final voicemail, and a hand-drawn note her father had made on the morning of his last trip. Abby spread everything across the exam table after Ethan returned, and in the cold fluorescent light, the past looked less like a tragedy and more like a route someone had tried to erase. The final chart of the St. Elian showed its last confirmed position southeast of Whitaker Point, but Daniel Turner's pencil mark circled a narrow blackwater channel directly below the cliff where Ethan had parked the Tahoe the night before, and beside it her father had written 3 words in block letters: "Light still active." Abby stared at the mark as if seeing it clearly for the first time, then looked at Ethan, and for the first time since he entered her clinic, her guarded anger became something sharper. "Your lighthouse is on my father's last map," she said, and Ethan heard the meaning under it. Their stories had met before either of them arrived. Across town, above the Cape Ashford Gazette office, Lily Turner was following a different thread through the same buried past, though she did not yet know Ethan's name. Lily was 27, Abby's younger sister, smaller and quicker than Abby, with short, sandy blonde hair that she cut herself when deadlines got bad. Bright, restless eyes behind square black glasses, and the stubborn energy of a reporter who had grown up watching adults use silence as a civic duty. Where Abby carried grief inward and made it useful through medicine, Lily turned grief outward, into questions, records requests, old invoices, and interviews people regretted giving her after the coffee wore off. That morning, while wind shook the Gazette's upstairs windows and the town's main street lay half-empty beneath snow, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by public contract files, scanning the faded municipal archives for anything connected to Whitaker Point, the St. Elian or Thomas Whitaker. What she found was not a confession, not even proof, but it was enough to make her sit very still. In the same fiscal year the rescue boat exploded, Cape Ashford had approved an emergency maritime security contract paid through a state coastal defense grant, and the recipient was Kane Maritime Defense, a private company owned by Victor Kane, the polished, silver-haired defense contractor whose smiling photograph still hung in the town hall lobby because he donated money to the Harbor Restoration Fund every Christmas. Victor Kane had not appeared in Cape Ashford as a villain. Men like him rarely did. In the newspaper photos, he looked like success carved into a human shape. Mid-50s, tall, clean-shaven, expensive wool coats, controlled smile, pale eyes that seemed friendly only because cameras required it. And for years the town had accepted his money because struggling towns on cold coastlines learned not to ask too many questions when checks cleared. Lily copied the contract number, cross-referenced it with an old shipping bulletin, and found that Kane's company had been granted temporary access to restricted waters near Whitaker Point during the same week Daniel Turner died. She called Abby immediately, but Abby did not answer because she was standing in her clinic with Ethan, staring at the same coastline from a different piece of evidence. Lily left a message anyway, her voice tense but excited. "Abby, I found Kane's name in the St. Elian year. Not Charity, not later, that year. Call me back before you do anything reckless, which means call me back now." Late afternoon darkened early over Cape Ashford, and Ethan left the clinic with Ranger moving better, but still favoring the wrapped paw, while Abby stood in the doorway, watching them with the expression of someone who had just learned the locked room in her childhood might have a key. She had given Ethan a name before he left, Samuel Briggs, a retired Coast Guard chief who lived alone near the old fish cannery north of town, a man people described as difficult, half-mad, or drunk depending on how much they needed to dismiss him, though Abby said her father had trusted him once. Ethan found Samuel's house at the end of a frozen lane where lobster traps leaned beneath snow, and gulls screamed over the gray water, and the man who opened the door was in his late 70s, narrow but still hard through the shoulders, with a white beard cut close, weather-cracked skin, one cloudy eye, and the posture of someone who had spent his youth on decks that tried to kill him. Samuel Briggs looked first at Ethan's uniform, then at Ranger's bandaged foot, then at the dog's face, and whatever anger he had prepared faded into something almost like sorrow. He stepped onto the porch without inviting Ethan inside, the wind pulling at his old Coast Guard sweater, and after a long silence, he said, "That dog didn't find the lighthouse, Commander Cole. He was brought back to the place your father wanted him to find." Samuel Briggs did not invite Ethan Cole inside right away, and for nearly a full minute the two men stood on the old porch above the frozen lane while the winter sea beat against the rocks beyond the cannery, and Ranger watched the retired Coast Guard chief with the quiet, measuring stare of a K-9, deciding whether an old man was a threat, a witness, or a ghost from someone else's war. Samuel was 77, narrow in the hips, but still strong through the shoulders, his white beard clipped close to a square jaw, one eye clouded from an old flare accident, the other pale blue and sharp enough to make age feel like camouflage rather than weakness. And though the town dismissed him as a bitter recluse who drank alone and shouted at foghorns, Ethan saw something more exact in the way Samuel stood, feet balanced, back slightly angled from the wind, hands visible but never careless. When Ethan repeated what Samuel had just said about Ranger being brought back to the place his father wanted found, the old man looked past him toward the gray line of Whitaker Point and finally opened the door wider, not as an act of welcome, but as an admission that whatever had stayed buried since the wreck of the St. Elian had begun moving again. Inside Samuel's house, the air smelled of wood smoke, salt-damp wool, engine grease, and black coffee left burning on the stove, and every wall carried the leftovers of a life spent between water and command. Faded Coast Guard photographs, brass weather instruments, storm charts, an old service flag folded behind cloudy glass, and a single framed picture turned face down on a shelf as if the man in it had done something Samuel could not forgive or could not survive remembering. Samuel poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs without asking Ethan if he wanted any, then stood over a kitchen table scarred by knives and cigarette burns, his fingers resting on the edge of an old chart case. "Your father was not assigned here on paper," he said, his voice low and worn. "But Commander Michael Cole came through Cape Ashford under naval authority 18 years ago, right before the St. Elian went down, and he was chasing a shipment that did not exist officially." Ethan's face did not move, but something behind his eyes tightened, because Michael Cole had been a man of clean uniforms, controlled silences, and absences explained by words like deployment, briefing, classified, and later accident, and Ethan had spent most of his life learning that the government could turn a father into a file with one stamped sentence. Samuel opened the chart case and pulled out a brittle maritime map marked with grease pencil, showing Whitaker Point, the Blackwater Channel below the lighthouse, and a route leading toward an area of restricted sea where a military transport vessel had disappeared the same week Daniel Turner died. The public story, Samuel said, was bad weather and mechanical failure, the kind of clean explanation people accepted because the ocean had always been generous with excuses. But Michael Cole believed the missing vessel had been used to move weapons guidance systems through civilian waters under the protection of Kane Maritime Defense. When Ethan heard Victor Kane's name, the room seemed to narrow because the same company Lily Turner had found in the town contracts now stood inside his father's past, no longer as a donor's name or a line in public records, but as a shape behind two dead fathers and a lighthouse no one wanted opened. Samuel described Michael as he remembered him. Early 40s then, lean, dark-haired, controlled in the way only men with too much responsibility learn to be controlled. Gray eyes that noticed exits and lies with equal speed, and a voice that never rose even when everyone else in the room started defending the official version. He thought Kane was moving hardware and erasing witnesses, Samuel said, and he thought Thomas Whitaker knew how the lighthouse had been used. By the time Ethan left Samuel's house, Ranger's bandaged paw had stiffened in the cold, but the dog refused the back seat and stood instead beside the Tahoe with his nose turned toward the cliff road, as if the lighthouse had begun calling through the weather again. Samuel rode with them, sitting in the passenger seat with an old canvas field bag across his knees. Quieter now, but not calmer, while Ethan drove back toward Whitaker Point, beneath a sky heavy with new snow. His full NWU Type 3 uniform remained neat beneath the dark winter jacket, the AOR2 digital woodland fabric damp at the sleeves, the brown combat boots steady against the pedals, and the closer they came to the lighthouse, the more his training rose through him again, not fear, not anger, but the cold mechanical patience of a Navy SEAL entering a structure where history had already proved it could kill men. Ranger stood braced in the rear cargo space, amber eyes fixed through the windshield, and when the tower finally emerged from the fog, dark against the sea and crooked under its crown of ice, the dog released a low breath that sounded almost human. They entered through the same door Ethan had found open the night before, but now the daylight made the place feel less haunted and more deliberate. Every broken plaster line, every footprint in the old dust, every smear near the stairwell showing itself like evidence under a work light. Ranger did not waste time circling the room. He moved straight to the warped paneling beside the cellar stairs and lowered his nose to the hollow place he had exposed, while Samuel stopped several feet back and whispered something Ethan did not catch. Ethan pulled a pry bar from his duffel, wedged it into the seam, and began stripping away the old boards, one controlled pull at a time, until the false wall opened wider and revealed not a passage of rotted wood, but a small steel door set into the foundation behind the lighthouse stairwell. It was too clean in its design to belong to the original structure, too heavy for a private hiding place, painted dull gray beneath peeling salt corrosion and locked with a recessed circular mechanism stamped with military-grade numbering that Samuel recognized before Ethan had to ask. "That is not county work," the old man said quietly, his weathered face draining of what little color the cold had left in it. "That was built by men who expected someone to try opening it." The lock did not respond to force, and Ethan did not waste time pretending strength could solve engineering, so he studied the dial, the wear marks, the old scratches near the hinge line, and the tiny corrosion pattern around the central release, while Ranger sat beside him, nose low, ears forward, patient in the same way he used to wait outside buried devices overseas. Samuel dug through his canvas bag and handed Ethan a small ring of keys, so old they looked useless, then admitted Thomas Whitaker had once left them in his mailbox with no explanation, wrapped in oilcloth and tied to a note that said only, "For the day, Michael's boy comes back." One of the keys matched nothing, another snapped before turning, and then the third slid deep into a hidden slot beneath the main dial, where it released a spring with a soft metallic click that seemed too loud in the dead tower. Ethan turned the wheel slowly, feeling the old mechanism fight him, then give, and the steel door opened inward on hinges that groaned like something waking after nearly 2 decades underground. Cold air rolled out first, carrying dust, old electronics, machine oil, saltwater stone, and the faint, dry smell of batteries kept alive long past their expected death. And beyond the door, a narrow concrete stairwell dropped beneath the Lighthouse foundation, lit by a single emergency bulb that flickered weakly in a wire cage. Samuel swore under his breath, not loudly, but with the kind of disbelief that came from seeing a rumor become architecture. Ethan went first with flashlight raised low, Ranger close at his left leg despite the bandaged paw, and Samuel behind them moving slower but steady, one hand along the wall as the stairwell curved downward beneath the tower. At the bottom, the passage opened into an observation room hidden under the cliff, not large but built with discipline. Concrete walls, a steel table bolted to the floor, old marine radios stacked beneath tarps, a backup generator coughing faintly in the corner, route charts pinned behind yellowed plastic, satellite photographs curling at the edges, and a narrow side tunnel sloping toward darkness where Ethan could hear, far away, the ocean breathing through rock. On the table sat an old reel-style cassette recorder beside a rusted microphone, and though everything else looked abandoned, a small red indicator light still blinked weakly near the power switch, as if someone had preserved just enough life in the room for this one machine to speak. Beside it lay satellite images of Cape Ashford's restricted waters, black and white shots of vessels moving at night, and a marked chart showing the St. Elian's final path turning toward the same dead channel Abby's father had circled on his map. Ethan saw Daniel Turner's name handwritten beside one coordinate, and below it another notation in Michael Cole's precise block letters. Rescue vessel responding to false distress transmission. Samuel put a hand on the table to steady himself, because in that instant the accident report became something smaller than a lie, and larger than murder. It became a plan. Ethan pressed play. Static filled the underground room, rough and hollow, then a man's voice emerged beneath the hiss. Older than Ethan remembered from childhood, but still unmistakably his father's, low, controlled, and heavy with the exhaustion of a man recording truth because he no longer trusted survival. "If this room is open," Commander Michael Cole said, "then Kane came back to clean what he missed, or my son finally found the door Thomas was too afraid to enter." Ethan did not move. Ranger leaned against his leg, grounding him without command. The recording continued, describing Kane Maritime Defense, the missing military equipment vessel, the false distress signal sent into the storm, and the deliberate shutdown of the Whitaker Point beacon that pushed the St. Elian into the Blackwater Channel, where Captain Daniel Turner tried to reach a ship carrying evidence, and instead carried his crew into a death zone. Michael's voice cracked only once, when he said the hard drive contained signal logs, payment records, and recorded orders proving the beacon failure was not mechanical, and that if the drive was still hidden, Kane would burn the whole coast before letting it surface. At that same hour, back in Cape Ashford, Abby Turner stood in her clinic office with Lily's message playing on speaker and her father's last chart spread beneath both hands. And as the wind pressed against the windows, she saw what grief had kept her from seeing for years. The marked channel, the lighthouse timing, the false distress window, and the possibility that Daniel Turner had not sailed into death by mistake, but into a rescue attempt for evidence powerful enough to get him killed. Abby's face remained steady, but her eyes filled before she could stop them, because the father she had mourned as a victim now became something even heavier to carry, A man who had died trying to save people from a truth others wanted drowned. Lily's discovery about Victor Kane no longer looked like corruption around the tragedy. It looked like the outer edge of the same machine. Abby grabbed her coat, the chart, and the old voicemail cassette, then locked the clinic door with hands that trembled only after the key turned. Below the lighthouse, Ethan stopped the tape when the recorder clicked into silence, and for several seconds no one spoke, because there are moments when truth does not arrive, as relief, but as weight. Samuel lowered himself into an old metal chair, staring at the dead radio banks as if he could still hear the men who had called for help 18 years earlier, while Ranger moved toward the side tunnel and sniffed the air coming from the cliff passage, his posture shifting from discovery to alert. Ethan reached for the recorder again, intending to replay the section about the hard drive, but before his fingers touched the button, the emergency bulb overhead flickered hard, once, then twice, then died. The generator cough stopped. The room went black except for Ethan's flashlight. Ranger spun toward the ceiling with sudden violence, hackles rising beneath his thick coat, and a deep growl rolled out of him as dust drifted down from above. Then Ethan heard it too, faint but undeniable through the concrete and stone. One slow footstep crossing the floor of the lighthouse overhead. The footstep above the hidden observation room did not come again at first, and that made it worse, because Ethan Cole had learned in places far from Maine that a careless enemy made noise twice, while a trained one made noise once, and then let fear do the rest. The underground room beneath Whitaker Point Lighthouse sat in total darkness, except for the narrow cone of Ethan's flashlight cutting across the steel table, the dead recorder, the marine charts, and Samuel Briggs's pale face, while Ranger stood with his injured paw planted carefully on the concrete and his thick black and tan body angled toward the ceiling, every muscle tight beneath his graying coat, his ears locked on something moving above them through wood, stone, and old air. Ethan was still in his full U.S. Navy working uniform. Type 3 beneath his winter jacket, AOR-2, digital woodland blouse and trousers, damp from the storm, brown combat boots silent against the floor, his broad shoulders still, and his steel blue eyes cold with the calm that came before violence, while Samuel, older and thinner but not helpless, reached under the steel table and pulled out a battered emergency lantern with hands that trembled only until work gave them purpose. When the lantern finally came alive in a weak amber glow, the room looked less like a forgotten archive and more like a bunker waiting for the men who had always known it existed. A second sound rolled down from above, not a footstep this time, but a faint scrape near the lighthouse entrance, followed by another from the direction of the cliff tunnel. And Ethan understood the shape of it before Samuel said anything. They were not being approached by one intruder, they were being boxed in. He killed the flashlight and moved to the side of the stairwell leading back up, listening through the concrete as the storm hammered the tower outside, and through that storm came the controlled rhythm of men, placing weight carefully, boots spreading across the frozen ground, one at the main door, one near the broken access gate, another moving toward the cliffside where the old service passage breathed sea air into the hidden room. Samuel whispered that they had come from the water, because no road vehicle had climbed the ridge since Ethan parked there. And Ethan pictured black inflatable boats landing below the rocks, silent engines cutting through icy surf, men in dark winter gear moving under the cover of snow and sea fog. They were not thieves, not local vandals, not curious hunters who had seen light in a condemned tower. Their spacing, their angles, their refusal to bunch near the door, all had the clean geometry of contractors trained to enter hostile structures and leave no witnesses. On the table beside the dead recorder, something Ethan had not noticed earlier lit up with a cold blue blink, half hidden under a folded satellite image, and Samuel's breath caught as Ethan lifted the paper and found a satellite phone, new, charged, and placed exactly where someone wanted it seen. It began vibrating before either man touched it, a sharp mechanical buzz against the metal that filled the room like an insect trapped inside a coffin. Ranger growled lower, lips lifting just enough to show teeth. Ethan let it ring twice, watching the screen show no name, only an encrypted number, then answered without speaking because men like the one calling did not need encouragement. The voice that came through was smooth, older, expensive, and controlled by habit, the voice of a man who had spent years making threats sound like advice. Victor Kane, mid-50s, publicly known in Cape Ashford as a polished defense executive with silver hair, tailored coats, pale eyes, and a donor's smile. But underneath that civic mask, Ethan now heard the flat confidence of someone who had ordered death from warm rooms and believed paperwork could bury blood. "Your father should have learned to stay quiet," Kane said, with the storm faint behind his own line. "And if you are Michael Cole's son, you already know what happens to men who mistake evidence for protection." Ethan did not answer right away, and the silence seemed to irritate Kane more than anger would have, because the voice sharpened slightly as he warned Ethan that the lighthouse was not inheritance, not history, and not a battlefield he could win with an old dog and a guilty Coast Guardsman. Samuel flinched at that last phrase, almost invisibly, but Ethan saw it, just as Ranger saw the old man's weight shift against the wall. Kane said the files had ruined better men than Ethan and that Thomas Whitaker had died, believing a locked door could stop the tide. Then the line clicked dead before Ethan could trace anything, though he knew tracing was meaningless here because Kane had not called to negotiate. He had called to prove he knew exactly where they were and exactly who stood in that hidden room. Above them, a flashlight beam swept briefly through the cracks of the stairwell door, thin white light sliding across dust like a knife. While Ethan and Samuel were trapped beneath the lighthouse, danger reached into town with quieter hands. At the Cape Ashford Gazette, Lily Turner sat alone in the upstairs office with a desk lamp burning over bank records she had pulled from an archived grant attachment, her short, sandy blonde hair tucked behind one ear, her black glasses slipping down her nose, her quick reporter's mind following account numbers through shell vendors until she found payments marked as witness consultation fees routed through a maritime legal fund tied to Kane Maritime Defense. The names matched 2 retired mechanics and a harbor dispatcher who had testified after the St. Ilian wreck that the beacon had failed naturally and the rescue vessel had been doomed before it left port, but the payments were dated before the final hearing, which meant Kane's people had bought the story before the town ever heard it. Lily stared at the screen, her usual restless energy turning into something colder, then copied the files to a drive and reached for her phone, but before Abby answered, glass broke downstairs in the Gazette lobby, not loudly enough for the street to hear over the storm, but loudly enough for Lily to turn off the lamp and freeze with one hand over her mouth as a dark figure moved below her among the desks. Abby Turner heard Lily whisper from a half-connected call while she was locking the clinic, and the fear in her sister's voice changed everything. Abby was still wearing her dark green clinic coat over jeans and snow boots, her auburn hair loosened by a long day, her hazel eyes no longer guarded but fixed with the same stubborn force that had kept her searching through her father's records for 18 years. And when Lily managed to breathe out Kane's name, secret accounts, witness payments, and someone inside the Gazette, Abby did not call the local sheriff because she no longer knew which men in Cape Ashford had been paid to look away. Instead, she grabbed her father's final chart, the voicemail cassette, and the medical field bag she used for injured animals pulled from storms, then told Lily to hide in the old archive closet behind the printing room and keep the copied files under her coat. Abby understood now that Ethan was not fighting a dead mystery beneath a lighthouse. He had stepped into a system that still had money, men, records, and fear working for it, and if she waited for permission to help him, the truth might be sealed again before dawn. Below Whitaker Point, the first breach came not from the main stairwell, but from the side tunnel that sloped toward the cliff, exactly where Ranger had been watching between every sound from above. A shadow moved in the dark passage, nearly invisible beyond the lantern glow, and Ethan saw only the dull outline of a compact rifle rising before Ranger launched himself forward with the old terrible speed that had saved men in Afghanistan. The attacker was broad, dressed in black maritime winter gear, with a balaclava pulled to his eyes. Professional enough not to shout when the dog hit him, but not fast enough to keep Ranger's jaws from closing on his forearm. They crashed against the concrete wall, the rifle firing once into the ceiling, with a blast that filled the small room and punched Ethan backward through memory for less than a heartbeat, rotor wash, dust, men shouting in another country, then Ranger's snarl dragged him back. Ethan moved before thought, driving his shoulder into the attacker and slamming the man's wrist against the table until the weapon dropped, while Samuel dragged the rifle away with a grunt and kicked it beneath the radio console. The intruder fought like a trained man, silent and economical, using knees, elbows, and leverage rather than panic, and when he twisted free, a short blade flashed in his gloved hand and caught Ranger along the ribs before Ethan drove him into the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him. Samuel struck him across the back of the head with the lantern base, and the man collapsed onto the concrete, alive but still. Ranger backed toward Ethan, growling, then his legs shifted unevenly, and Ethan saw the dark blood spreading beneath the fur along his side, not a deep arterial wound, but enough to turn the world narrow around the dog. Gunfire cracked somewhere above the lighthouse, muffled through stone and storm, and Samuel told Ethan they had seconds, but Ethan was already on one knee beside Ranger, pressing gauze from his field kit against the cut, tying a pressure wrap beneath the dog's chest, his hand steady with the same practiced brutality he had used on wounded teammates in places where waiting for medevac meant dying. Ranger did not bite, did not pull away, only stared at Ethan with those amber-brown eyes, while his breath came fast through his nose, trusting him completely in a room full of blood, old secrets, and men coming to erase both. When the bandage held and Ranger forced himself upright, despite Ethan's order to stay down, Samuel looked at the dog as if seeing every debt of his life gathered into one wounded animal, and something inside the old Coast Guardsman finally broke. He lowered himself onto the metal chair beside the table, no longer pretending age or guilt could be outrun, while above them the storm and the men in black tightened around the lighthouse. Ethan turned on him slowly, because Kane's words had found a crack, and the old man's silence had widened it. Samuel stared at Michael Cole's chart under the lantern light and said that 18 years ago, Commander Cole had not only suspected the truth, he had found part of the proof and handed it to Samuel for safekeeping before going back out to meet Thomas Whitaker. Samuel had hidden the evidence because Victor Kane's people came to his house the next night and described exactly how his wife, his daughter, and every man he had ever served beside could disappear under official explanations if he tried to speak. His voice roughened, but he did not ask for forgiveness. "Your father didn't die because nobody could save him," Samuel said, looking Ethan in the eyes at last. "He died because too many of us were too scared to stand beside him, and we let silence do what Kane's bullet started. Ranger should not have been climbing stairs, not with the bandage across his ribs, darkening under his black and tan coat, and not with the shallow cut in his front paw, already stiff from cold concrete and broken glass. But the old German Shepherd K9 moved before Ethan Cole could stop him, nose low, shoulders tight, body working against pain with the grim patience of an animal trained to finish the search even when the search cost blood. Above them, the lighthouse groaned under the storm and under the boots of Victor Kane's men, while below in the hidden observation room, the satellite phone lay silent on the table beside Michael Cole's dead recording, and Samuel Briggs stood with his back against the wall, breathing like a man whose guilt had finally become heavier than his fear. Ethan still in his damp U.S. Navy working uniform, Type 3 under his winter jacket, AOR-2 digital woodland blouse and trousers smeared with dust from the bunker, brown combat boots planted steady on the old steps, watched Ranger drag himself toward the spiral stairwell instead of the tunnel, and the decision in the dog's amber eyes made the choice for him before his mind could argue. "He's got the scent," Ethan said, and Samuel looked toward the darkness above as if the tower itself had just accused him. They moved upward inside the lighthouse with no wasted sound, Ethan first with one hand on Ranger's harness to steady the wounded dog, Samuel behind them carrying the captured compact rifle with an old Coast Guardsman's stiff but careful grip, and every curve of the spiral stairs carried them closer to the lantern room where the wind screamed louder through cracked seams in the glass. The tower's upper chamber was colder than the rooms below, round and narrow beneath the iron ribs of the lantern housing, with old windows fogged by salt and snow, the Atlantic flashing in broken white fragments far below the cliff. And in the center stood the massive Fresnel lens, a beautiful dust-covered giant of brass and glass that once turned light into salvation for men at sea. Ranger went straight to the base of the lens, not to the windows, not to the door, but to the circular iron pedestal beneath the old rotating mechanism, where he pressed his nose against a seam so fine Ethan might have missed it if the dog had not begun scratching at the metal with one paw. Slow, painful, stubborn, each scrape ringing faintly through the lantern room like a signal from inside the dead machine. Ethan knelt beside the pedestal and found the hidden screws beneath a rim of salt corrosion, then worked them loose with the knife from his jacket, while Samuel watched the stairwell and muttered that Thomas Whitaker had maintained the lantern for 30 years, long enough to hide a confession inside the light itself. The cover finally shifted with a soft metallic grind, and when Ethan pulled it free, he found a waterproof case wedged inside the hollow core of the old rotating shaft, black, military-grade, sealed with wax tape and wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp air. Ranger lowered his head and exhaled once, not relief exactly, but recognition fulfilled, then swayed hard enough that Ethan had to catch him by the chest before the dog's injured side hit the floor. Inside the case lay a rugged external hard drive, 3 labeled videotapes, a packet of printed wire transfer lists, clipped radio transcripts, and a sealed letter addressed in the handwriting Ethan remembered from old birthday cards, signed too quickly before his father left again. Ethan, when you are old enough to hate me, read this before you decide what kind of man I was. Ethan did not want to open the letter in that room, with gunmen below and snow beating against the glass above. But some messages are heavier unopened than read, so he broke the seal and unfolded the paper while Samuel kept his eyes turned away. Michael Cole's words were spare, controlled, and painfully human beneath the military precision, telling his son that he had never wanted him to inherit a war, never wanted him to build his life around revenge, never wanted the truth to become another weapon placed in his hands. But if the evidence stayed buried, powerful men would keep killing the innocent and calling it weather, mechanical failure, hostile action, or whatever word made grief easier to file. Ethan's face remained still as he read, yet his hand tightened around the paper when Michael wrote that Daniel Turner had not been a stranger caught in the wrong storm, but a brave captain who answered a false distress call because he believed men were alive on a vessel carrying proof, and that his death had been the price Kane paid to keep the sea quiet. Ranger leaned against Ethan's knee through the whole letter, trembling from blood loss, but still awake, still guarding, as if the dog understood that this paper was not only memory, but a command passed from the dead to the living. Below the cliff road, Abby Turner fought the storm in her old blue Subaru, with Lily crouched in the passenger seat, both sisters soaked with snow and panic, but alive, because Lily had escaped the Gazette through the back archive window with a flash drive hidden inside her coat after the intruder searched the newsroom floor by floor. Lily looked younger in fear than she did behind her reporter's glasses, her short, sandy blonde hair damp against her face, her restless mouth pressed into a hard line, but her hands never let go of the drive containing Kane's witness payments. Abby, auburn hair whipping loose from its tie, hazel eyes fixed through the windshield, drove like someone who had spent 18 years waiting for one night to make sense of every question. When they reached Whitaker Point, they found no open road, only storm, black shapes moving near the lighthouse base, and smoke beginning to twist from one lower window where Kane's men had thrown something burning inside the keeper's cottage to flush Ethan downward. Abby did not scream, did not freeze. She grabbed her father's chart, the cassette, and the medical bag, and led Lily along the lee side of the stone wall toward the service entry Samuel had marked years ago on a maintenance map she had never known how to read until now. They reached the lantern stairwell just as Ethan and Samuel came down from above with Ranger between them, and for one breath the whole buried past gathered in the narrow curve of the tower. Ethan carrying his father's case, Abby clutching Captain Daniel Turner's final map, Lily holding proof that Kane had bought witnesses before the official hearing, Samuel carrying the shame of the man who had hidden what he was too afraid to expose, and Ranger bleeding quietly at their feet while still watching the darkness below. Abby dropped to one knee beside the dog immediately, her veterinarian's instincts cutting through the terror, her hands gentle but fast as she checked the wound beneath the pressure wrap, and told Ethan it was ugly but survivable if they got him out soon. Then Ethan laid Michael Cole's radio transcripts beside Daniel Turner's chart, and Abby saw the two halves locked together. Her father had turned toward a cargo vessel Kane wanted erased, while Ethan's father had recorded the order that killed the beacon, falsified the distress call, and turned the St. Elian into a grave. Lily photographed the documents with shaking hands, whispering that this was enough to break Kane if they lived long enough to upload it, and from outside, Victor Kane's amplified voice rolled through the storm, calm and furious, ordering his men to burn the tower if they could not recover the case. The fire moved fast through the keeper's cottage and into the lower hall where old wood, dry insulation, and decades of neglect fed it greedily, and smoke began climbing the spiral stairwell in dark ribbons that turned the lighthouse into a chimney. Samuel looked at the flames below and made the kind of decision old guilty men make when they believe death can become apology. He stepped toward the lower landing with the rifle and told Ethan to take Abby, Lily, the dog, and the case through the cliff passage while he held the stairwell as long as he could. Ethan grabbed him before the old man could pass, hard enough to make Samuel wince, and there was no forgiveness in Ethan's face, but there was something stronger than punishment. "No more fathers dying in doorways," Ethan said, voice low, and when Samuel tried to pull away, Ethan shoved the case against Lily, lifted Ranger's harness with one arm, and dragged Samuel back with the other, because this story was not going to buy truth with another old man's body if Ethan could still stop it. Ranger found the escape before any of them did, staggering away from the smoke toward the machine room behind the lantern service shaft, where rusted gears, old oil drums, and broken maintenance tools lay beneath a trapdoor, nearly invisible under a rubber mat hardened by age. Abby helped Ethan lift the door while Lily coughed into her sleeve, and Samuel held the rifle toward the stairs. And below it, a narrow iron ladder dropped into a service tunnel, sloping toward the sea. A forgotten keeper's route used when storms made the Maine cliff road impossible. They descended one by one into wet stone darkness, Ethan half carrying Ranger when the dog's legs weakened, Abby behind him with the medical bag, Lily clutching the case and flash drive under her coat, Samuel last, coughing from smoke but alive, while above them the lighthouse filled with fire and Kane's men shouted through the lower rooms, believing the flames had trapped everyone inside. The tunnel ran under the cliff through cold salt air and dripping rock, and behind them the tower burned brighter, its windows glowing like a warning lantern turned blood red against the blizzard. They emerged into a sea cave under Whitaker Point, where waves smashed white against black stone, and the tide rose fast around the lower rocks, cutting off the beach in pieces with every surge. For a moment, they stood in the roar of the ocean, smoke trailing from their coats, Ranger leaning heavily against Ethan, but still breathing, Abby's chart soaked against her chest, Lily's face pale but fierce as she checked that the case remained sealed, and Samuel staring back toward the burning lighthouse as if the past itself had finally caught fire. Then headlights moved above the cliff path, and a dark figure appeared on the rocks beyond the cave mouth, tall, silver-haired, even beneath a black storm hood, his expensive coat snapping in the wind, pale eyes fixed not on the flames, but on the case in Lily's hands. Victor Kane had not believed the fire was enough. He had followed them down to the water, and as the tide climbed around the stones, Ethan knew the final fight would happen here, between the sea that had swallowed the truth once and the people who had carried it out alive. Victor Kane stood on the black rocks below Whitaker Point, with the burning lighthouse behind him and the rising Atlantic in front of him, looking less like a man cornered by a storm than a man offended that the world had stopped obeying him. His silver hair slick beneath a dark hood, his expensive coat snapping hard in the wind, his pale eyes fixed on the waterproof case in Lily Turner's arms, as if everyone else on that shore existed only as obstacles between him and the evidence. Ethan Cole stepped out from the sea cave first, Ranger pressed against his left leg and breathing hard through the pain in his bandaged ribs, while Abby Turner stayed close behind with her father's soaked chart inside her coat. Lily held the case and flash drive against her chest with both hands, and Samuel Briggs leaned against the cave wall with the captured rifle lowered but ready, his face gray from smoke, guilt, and blood loss, yet still alive. The tide had begun swallowing the lower stones in long white surges, and every wave that struck the cliff sent cold spray over them like thrown glass. Kane's voice carried above the surf with that same controlled smoothness Ethan had heard through the satellite phone, though now there was anger beneath it, a hard shine cracking through the polished donor mask Cape Ashford had mistaken for generosity. He told Ethan to hand over the drive before the sea took them all, and then he smiled as if the whole thing amused him, saying no court would trust a Navy SEAL with trauma, a veterinarian still chasing her dead father's ghost, a small-town reporter stealing records from archives, and an old Coast Guardsman who had already admitted he hid evidence for 18 years. Ethan did not move toward him, and he did not look back at Samuel because the words were aimed like bullets at the weakest parts of every person standing there. But Ranger growled low beside him, not loudly, not with rage, only with the old certain warning of a K-9 who knew when a man was preparing to do violence and had already decided where he would place his body when it came. Lily Turner, soaked through and shaking from cold, looked nothing like the fearless reporter she tried to be in print. Her short, sandy blonde hair plastered to her forehead and her square black glasses speckled with salt spray, but her voice held when she said Kane was too late. During the escape through the tunnel, while smoke moved above them and the service passage still carried a weak emergency signal through an old rescue transmitter her father had once marked on Abby's maintenance map, Lily had pushed part of the hard drive index, the witness payment ledger, and the first radio transcript into an automatic upload queue through the Gazette's remote server. And even if the full files sat inside the case, enough had already left Whitaker Point to wake people who could not all be bought before sunrise. Abby added, quieter but steadier, that she had sent copies of her father's chart, the voicemail, and the transfer numbers to Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Mercer, a federal lawyer in Boston her father had once trusted before the final hearing, a woman in her early 50s, known for gray suits, severe black hair, and a reputation for taking cases other prosecutors called career suicide when the documents were clean and the victims had names. For the first time, Kane's confidence shifted, only a fraction, but Ethan saw it the way he saw a shoulder tighten before a draw, and the movement told him the upload mattered. Kane lifted the handgun from beneath his coat without drama, exactly the way Ethan expected a man to do it when he had stopped pretending this was negotiation, and for one narrow second the storm, the fire, the surf, and the 18 years of buried truth seemed to tighten around the barrel. Abby pulled Lily behind her by instinct. Samuel raised the rifle, but too slowly, and Ethan moved just enough to put himself between the weapon and the others, knowing he could not cross the distance before the shot. Ranger moved faster than any wounded animal should have moved. The German shepherd lunged from beside Ethan with a broken, furious burst of loyalty. Not high enough to attack Kane's throat, not strong enough for the clean takedowns he had made years earlier, but enough to slam his shoulder into Kane's knees on the slick rock as a wave crashed over both of them. Kane fired once into the storm, the shot disappearing into the roar, and then his polished shoes slid out from under him. Ethan reached him before Kane could recover, driving him down hard against the wet stone and pinning the gun wrist beneath one knee, while the surf rolled over them cold enough to steal breath. Everything in Ethan that had waited years without knowing what it waited for rose in that moment. His father's letter, Michael Cole's voice on the tape, Abby's chart, Daniel Turner's final warning, Samuel's confession, Ranger's blood on his hands, and for one dangerous breath he could have ended Kane there where the sea had swallowed so many answers. But Ethan did not. He twisted the weapon free, threw it into the surf, and held Kane's face against the rock until the man stopped fighting, because killing him would only make him another dead secret, and Ethan wanted him breathing when the world learned his name. Ranger collapsed beside Abby after the lunge, trembling violently, and Abby dropped to her knees with her medical bag open before Kane had even stopped cursing, pressing both hands to the dog's side and telling him in the same voice she had used in the clinic that he was not allowed to leave after doing the hard part. Dawn came slowly, gray and bruised, over a coastline still smoking from the Lighthouse fire, and with it came the sound of engines that did not belong to Kane. Coast Guard boats broke through the rough water below the point, while federal vehicles rolled down the cliff road above, called in by Lily's upload and Abby's message before the signal died, and the first officer down the rocks was Commander Rachel Hayes, a Coast Guard commander in her 40s, with close-cropped dark hair, a weather-burned face, and the clipped authority of someone who had spent her career dragging truth out of storms. Beside her came Special Agent Nora Whitfield, a tall federal investigator with brown skin, a heavy Navy parka, and calm eyes that missed nothing, who took one look at the burned tower, the waterproof case, Kane face down under Ethan's control, and Samuel bleeding against the cave wall, and understood that the reports she had received during the night were only the surface of something much older. Kane's men were rounded up along the cliff road and near the burned keeper's cottage, some injured, some silent, all suddenly less loyal with federal lights flashing over them. And Victor Kane was cuffed alive, while Lily kept filming with shaking hands. The weeks that followed did not heal anything quickly, but they moved truth into daylight. The hard drive, videotapes, wire transfers, radio logs, and Lily's uploaded files opened federal investigations, congressional hearings, maritime inquiries, and military reviews that powerful people had spent 18 years avoiding. Captain Daniel Turner's name was cleared publicly, no longer reduced to an engine failure in a storm, and Commander Michael Cole's final actions were restored to the record as those of an officer who tried to expose a cover-up before it killed more innocent people. Samuel Briggs survived after surgery for smoke damage and a shoulder wound, and when he later sat before investigators, smaller than he had looked on the lighthouse stairs, but finally steady, he told the truth without protecting himself. He apologized to Abby and Ethan in a courthouse hallway, with his white beard trembling and his one clear eye wet, and Ethan did not give him easy forgiveness, because some silence costs too much for one apology to pay. But he did place a hand on the old man's shoulder and tell him to live long enough to keep testifying. Ranger survived too, because Abby refused to let him become another sacrifice to be honored after the fact. She operated on him through the morning at Turner Animal Clinic, her face pale with exhaustion, her hands precise despite the blood, Lily asleep in a chair with the case under her arm until federal agents took it into evidence, and Ethan sitting on the floor outside the surgery room in his torn NWU Type 3 uniform, brown boots still crusted with salt, staring at his hands until Abby finally opened the door. Ranger would limp, she said, and the scar along his ribs would stay under the fur forever. But he was alive, and when Ethan stepped into the recovery room, the old German shepherd lifted his head weakly and thumped his tail once against the blanket, as if coming home had always meant surviving one more impossible night. Spring returned to Cape Ashford slowly, washing ash from the cliff and pulling green through the blackened ground around Whitaker Point, and Ethan did not sell the land. With Abby, Lily, Samuel, Commander Hayes, and half the town watching, the ruined lighthouse became something new. Not a monument to fear, but a rescue station named Cole Turner Rescue Light, built to honor two fathers who had died trying to keep truth from drowning. Months later, Ethan lived in a small cedar house near the rebuilt tower, no longer sleeping in government vehicles or moving from assignment to assignment like a man afraid stillness would catch him, while Ranger lay on the porch each evening with his scar hidden beneath thicker fur, watching the sea with the serious calm of an old guardian who had earned rest. Abby came often, sometimes with medicine for Ranger, and sometimes with no excuse at all. Lily's investigative series changed the town that once preferred silence, and Samuel sat in the back of every public hearing until the last man tied to Cain had answered under oath. On the first gentle snow of the next winter, Ethan opened the restored lighthouse door and stepped aside, and this time Ranger walked in first without growling, without fear, his nails clicking softly on clean wood as the lamp above came alive and sent a white beam sweeping across the dark Atlantic, a promise moving over the water that some truths could be buried for years, but not forever, and that even the longest road through fire and storm could still lead home. Sometimes God does not send a miracle as a flash of light from the sky. Sometimes He sends it through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through one brave person who chooses truth over fear, through a wounded heart that still keeps walking, and through a door that finally opens after years of darkness. Ethan, Ranger, Abby, Lily, and Samuel remind us that in daily life, many people carry hidden storms, old pain, buried regrets, and truths they are afraid to face. But God can still guide the right steps at the right time. The lesson of this story is that darkness may hide the truth for a season, but it cannot defeat the light forever. When we choose courage instead of silence, faith instead of fear, mercy instead of revenge, and justice instead of hatred, God can turn even a broken past into a path toward healing. Maybe you are also facing something heavy today, a secret pain, a hard decision, or a battle no one else can see, but remember that you are not alone, and God can still make a way through the storm. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe God still brings truth into the light, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, justice, healing, and redemption. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your heart, guide your steps, and fill your life with peace, courage, and light.